Namaste, everyone. I'm Sunita Vishwanath. I'm one of the co-founders of Hindus for Human Rights. And I am so excited to welcome you to Hindus for Human Rights' inaugural Baithak for Liberation. This is a new series of online discussions designed to critically explore what it means to imagine a Hinduism that is rooted in love and liberation in our contemporary moment. We say all the time in Hindus for Human Rights that we are anti-caste Hindus. But this series helps us explore what that actually means concretely in our lives. And what historical legacy do we draw from as we build a truly liberatory Hinduism for our times? Through this series, we will bring together scholars and practitioners to examine the ways Hindu traditions and teachings can infuse ordinary lives with the tools to connect our religious practice with a commitment to justice in the world. The series also aspires to inform struggles for justice and structural transformation, particularly for those systematically marginalized at the intersections of caste, gender, sexuality, class, ability, and other structures of oppression reinforced by Brahminical patriarchy and its entanglements with colonialism and capitalism. Our Baithaks will also invigorate our nascent work on a liberatory Hindu theology for our times through our new initiative, Samadarshini, affirming the dignity and equality of all. Baithak is a Hindu Urdu word for a sitting and generally implies an intimate gathering for intellectual and artistic exchange. Baithaks have long been places for transformative thought in South Asian communities, from facilitating the spread of spiritual teachings during the Bhakti period to enabling cross-cultural exchange in the Mughal courts to serving as centers for anti-colonial discourse during the era of the British rule. We invite all our participants to come to our Baithaks for Liberation with questioning minds, open ears, shedding preconceived notions which are almost always rooted in our own bias, and ready for transformation. In that spirit of fostering an environment of open-mindedness and free discussion, I should take this opportunity to note that the views expressed by our speakers today are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of Hindus for Human Rights. We hope that through this and other initiatives, Hindus for Human Rights can begin to bridge, or at least inch towards bridging, the chasms that divide us from each other and from our own true and liberated selves. Hindus for Human Rights is a space for Hindus of conscience to learn about and embrace the aspects of Hindu traditions and texts that support the liberation of all, and boldly jettison those aspects that deny the humanity and divinity of all. Since Smritis have human authors, there's no reason we cannot empower ourselves to write the Smritis of today and tomorrow together. We are very fortunate to have as our moderator today, Dr. Balmurli Natarajan, a friend, a comrade, and an advisory board member of Hindus for Human Rights. After I introduce Murli, Murli himself will introduce our two esteemed speakers, Swami Medhananda and Govind Krishna. I am deeply grateful to both of them and Murli for being with us today. I'll say a bit more about Murli. Dr. Natarajan is a professor of anthropology at William Paterson University in New Jersey. His research is on group formation and inequalities, especially caste, on culture theory and different aspects of socio-economic development. His books include Culturalization of Caste in India, Identity and Inequality in a Multicultural Age, which explains the legitimation and hence persistence of caste in India today, and a co-edited volume, Against Stigma, Studies in Caste, Race, and Justice since Durban. He has published scholarly and popular papers on food politics, domestic workers, authoritarian populism, and most recently on toilet behavior and sanitation policy in India. I'm so honored that Murli is part of the HfHR family by serving on our advisory board. So with that, I hand it over to Murli to welcome our speakers and to welcome all of you. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Sunita, and the organizers, and welcome everybody. This Baithak comes out of a deep commitment and a continual struggle on the part of HfHR. The commitment is to conceive of things of the spirit as a this-worldly orientation in engagement with this world, not to run away from it, nor to dismiss the world as unreal, and surely not to remain apathetic or indifferent to its sufferings and miseries. The struggle is to build a philosophical and political basis for a Hindu who is clearly opposed to the politics of monoculture, inequality, exclusion, oppression, and exploitation. Or to put it more positively, the struggle is to craft a life of a Hindu committed to and struggling for principles of equity, valuing of difference, steadfast in reason, and driven by love and compassion in thought, practice, relations to others, and in philosophy. Today, we will clarify and deepen this commitment and this struggle. Too often, the activist and the philosopher do not meet. Each mocks the other, either as being all words and no action, or as just being political action. But philosophy without action remains fanciful, and action without philosophy is impoverished. Our task today has been made possible by someone who combined philosophy with action. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, writing at the height of his oppressions and humiliations at the hands of Hindus, indicted Hindus in very clear terms. Yet, he did so with a graciousness of spirit that is forgotten in the din of activism or prejudices, or dismissed by those who get too defensive too easily about the valid criticisms of Ambedkar. Here are Ambedkar's words from 1936, something that rings as true today. I quote, "While I condemn a religion of rules, I must not be understood to hold the opinion that there is no necessity for a religion. When I urge that these ancient rules of life be annulled, I am anxious that their place shall be taken by a religion of principles, which alone can lay claim to being a true religion. You," these meaning Hindus, "must give a new doctrinal basis to your religion, a basis that will be in consonance with liberty, equality, and fraternity, in short, with democracy. It may not be necessary for you to borrow from foreign sources, and you could draw for such principles on the Upanishads. This means a complete change in the fundamental notion of life. It means a complete change in the values of life. It means a complete change in outlook and in attitude towards humans and things. It means new life." End quote. To tweak a note from Martin Luther King Jr.'s paraphrasing of the abolitionist minister Theodore Parker, Ambedkar's words demand that the arc of truth in any philosophical tradition be in sync with the arc of justice. Truth cannot be delinked from the quest for being just. Both speakers today show us one way to do what Ambedkar demanded. Both distill, clarify, and reinterpret, and hence revitalize the teachings of a teacher who has been appropriated by Hindutva. I refer, of course, to Swami Vivekananda. Wresting Vivekananda from the hands of Hindutva can be a powerful strategy. For Hindutva's proponents, who are also caste proponents, the two go together, regularly claim Swami Vivekananda for their side. We will hear from our speakers about why Hindutva cannot easily claim Vivekananda. To be clear, Baithaks are places of dialogue and reflection. Our task is not to glorify, deify, reify, or recreate icons, nor to cancel, denigrate, or disrespect the other. Only deep listening and reflection, coupled with honesty to one's own self, can deepen and strengthen our commitments and struggles. Only then can we actually build a religion of principles. So some very brief introductions about our erudite and inspiring speakers. Swami Medhananda is a monk of the Ramakrishna order. He is the Hindu chaplain at UCLA and the University of Southern California. Trained in philosophy, He received a PhD in philosophy, specifically German aesthetics. Swami Medhananda is a prolific writer on the philosophy of religion, on epistemology of mystical experience, hermeneutics, and Vedantic philosophical traditions. His latest book, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, brings into relief the idea of engagement with this world as being the heart of Vedanta, a tradition that has sadly neglected this fact at its own peril. He has also written specifically on Swami Vivekananda's teachings and its opposition to Hindutva and caste. Swami Medhananda is also actively engaged in editing academic journals and regularly gives public talks on the teachings of Vivekananda, Sharda Mai, and Ramakrishna. Our second speaker, Govind Krishnan, is a scholar and a long form journalist based in Bangalore, but reporting from different parts of India. In 2014, he received the Red Ink Award for Human Rights Reporting. He has written on politics, corruption, science, development, agriculture, and religious fundamentalism. He was shortlisted for the prestigious Einstein Fellowship in 2018 and received the Aga Shahid Ali Award for Poetry instituted by Poetry Chain. Govind's recent book, Vivekananda, Philosopher of Freedom, is a fascinating intervention that boldly and carefully makes a strong case that Vivekananda stands in direct opposition to all the fundamentalist tenets of Hindutva. Please join me in welcoming our two speakers. Swami Medhananda, over to you.
Thank you so much to both Sunita and Murli for inviting me to this very important event. And yes, so Swami Vivekananda's complex legacy, his legacy was indeed and has been indeed complex. On the one hand, we find many people lionizing Swami Vivekananda as an extremely progressive and liberal and cosmopolitan Hindu thinker. And he was an inspiration to many of the freedom fighters in the early 20th century, and profoundly cosmopolitan and progressive and liberal in his outlook. At the same time, as Murli mentioned, there are a number of right-wing Hindu organizations who have appropriated Swami Vivekananda as a right-wing Hindu icon and as one of their chief inspirations. And now in terms of academic scholarship, there are a number of scholars, most notably, I would say, at least recently, Jyotirmaya Sharma. He wrote an entire book called A Restatement of Religion, arguing that Swami Vivekananda was the father and preceptor of Hindutva. And I wrote an article called Was Swami Vivekananda a Hindu Supremacist? Revisiting a Long-Standing Debate, published in 2020. It's an article-length critique of Sharma's interpretation of Vivekananda and his attempt to cast Vivekananda as a kind of proto-Hindu nationalist and fundamentalist and supremacist. What I'm going to do in the brief time that I have is summarize some of the main arguments from that article. But for people who are interested in going deeper, I encourage you to look at my article, which you can find on my website. So in this brief time, I want to make three main arguments. First, that right-wing Hindu organizations like the RSS have misappropriated Swami Vivekananda as one of their chief inspirations, and that left-wing critiques of Swami Vivekananda as a Hindu fundamentalist, like Sharma's, overlook major nuances in Swami Vivekananda's views, and even more fundamentally, his crucially important 19th century historical context. That's also something that Govind emphasizes in his work. Secondly, Vivekananda was not a Hindu fundamentalist or supremacist, but what I would call a cosmopolitan patriot. This is a term I borrow from Kwame Anthony Appiah, who laid the foundations for the freedom movement, instilled pride and self-confidence in Indians during colonial rule. And thirdly, and this is another major argument I want to make or begin to make, that Swami Vivekananda, far from supporting the hereditary caste system, scathingly criticized it. And I'll give you some evidence of that. And he welcomed its demise, and he defended what he took to be the original caste system, which was based not on heredity, but on our innate tendencies and our behavior. Okay, so that's probably already too much, but I'll just plunge right in. Let me read to you a statement Swami Vivekananda made to his fellow Indians in 1897. If one of our countrymen stands up and tries to become great, we all try to hold him down. But if a foreigner comes and tries to kick us, it is all right. We've been used to it, have we not? And slaves must become great masters. So give up being a slave. For the next 50 years, this alone shall be our keynote. This, our great mother India. Let all other vain gods disappear for the time from our minds. What is he saying here? Keep in mind the historical context. This is British colonial India. This is a time when Christian missionaries are rampant throughout the country, trying aggressively to convert Hindus to Christianity. And Swami Vivekananda sees basically a slave race. And he's looking at these Hindus and these Indians and telling them to have self-confidence, to have pride and reverence for their own great spiritual traditions. And in that context, he's actually scathingly criticizing the more ethnic and meaningless and superstition aspects of Hinduism that was prevalent during that time. So let me read you another passage. And before I do, I also want to mention that that statement made in 1897, that for the next 50 years, this alone shall be our keynote. Is it a coincidence that in 1947, India gained its independence? That Swami Vivekananda clearly was a major figure in the freedom movement in his own way, but just not in a directly activistic sense. And here in a letter from 1894, Swami Vivekananda says the following: if you want any good to come, just throw your religious ceremonials overboard and worship the living God, the man God, every being that wears a human form, Virat and Swarat, God in the form of the individual. The Virat form of God is this world, and worshiping it means serving it. Shiva. That indeed is work, not indulging in ceremonials. Neither is it work to cogitate as to whether the rice plate should be placed in front of the god for 10 minutes or for half an hour. That is called lunacy. Now the Lord is having his toilet. Now he is taking his meals. Now he is busy on something else, we know not what. And all this while the living God is dying for want of food, for want of education. These are very powerful statements where Swamiji, seems to be very socially activistic, actually, in saying that a true Hindu is going to want to serve his fellow beings in a spirit of worship by trying to see the same divine in everybody. I want to mention that Govind, who's about to speak after me, I'm going to quote from one of his works from 2014, who says that one of the problems with Sharma and other critics of Vivekananda who kind of paint him as a proto-Hindu nationalist is that they write as if Vivekananda and Ramakrishna exist in some ahistorical transcendental space. And I think that's a serious problem with leftist critiques of Swami Vivekananda. Anantaran Rambachan has done some important work on this issue. And in 2005, he wrote an article, I think very convincingly showing that Swami Vivekananda's conception of Hinduism is diametrically opposed to the kind of Hindutva espoused by people like Savarkar, who define Hinduism in terms of Rashtra, Jati, and Sanskriti, nation, race, and culture, grounded in ethnicity and bloodlines. And I can't go into the details, but if you just look at Swami Vivekananda's paper on Hinduism from 1893, you'll find that he's doing exactly what Ambedkar, Murli mentioned Ambedkar's beautiful statement. It's exactly what Swami Vivekananda is doing, is that he's redefining Hinduism in terms of core principles. That's also, by the way, something that I did very recently in a lecture I gave 2 weeks ago called Is Vedanta Hindu? Now, with regard to this question of Swami Vivekananda's role or lack thereof in the freedom movement, let me read you a couple of statements he made. First, in an 1894 letter to Alasinga Perumal, he says, I am no politician or political agitator. I care only for the spirit. When that is right, everything will be righted by itself. And he says along the same lines in an 1895 interview, religion is of deeper importance than politics since it goes to the root and deals with the essential of conduct. And so the way I see this is that as a cosmopolitan patriot, Swami Vivekananda is paving the spiritual foundations for the freedom movement without being directly activistic, even though he was very scathing about British colonial rule, and he was very explicit about it. And that's, I think, part of the reason why so many of the great freedom fighters credited Swami Vivekananda as one of their chief inspirations. So I just wanted to read to you one statement made by Nehru in 1949, just after India's independence. He says, Swami Vivekananda was no politician in the ordinary sense of the word, and yet he was, I think, one of the great founders, if you like, you may use any other word, of the national modern movement of India. And a great number of people who took more or less an active part in that movement in a later date drew their inspiration from Swami Vivekananda. Another aspect of Swami Vivekananda's cosmopolitan patriotism is that at the same time that he was encouraging a reverence for Hindus' own indigenous spiritual traditions, he also encouraged them to be open to learning from other cultures and other countries. This is also something that's anathema to the Hindutva movement. And I want to give you an example. This is a statement from 1897. Swami Vivekananda says, "Several dangers are in the way, and one is that of the extreme conception that we are the people in the world. With all my love for India, and with all my patriotism and veneration for the ancients, I cannot but think that we have to learn many things from other nations. At the same time, we must not forget that we have also to teach a great lesson to the world. We cannot do without the world outside India. It was our foolishness that we thought we could, and we have paid the penalty by about 1,000 years of slavery." Okay, and I want to, in the very little time I have remaining, now address Swami Vivekananda's views on the caste system. While some people claim that, like Sharma, Jyotirmaya Sharma and others, claim that Vivekananda was a proponent of the status quo, the hereditary caste system, I think that's a serious mistake, and I want to just begin to give you some evidence. If you want details, please look at my article. So, in fact, Vivekananda was scathing in his criticism of the hereditary caste system, and he referred, for instance, to Rakshasas in the shape of the Brahmins of the Kali Yuga. He says, a country where millions of people live on flowers of the muhua plant, and 1 million or 2 of sadhus and 100 million or so of Brahmins suck the blood out of these poor people without even the least effort for their amelioration. Is that a country or hell? Is that a religion or the devil's dance? Again, he says, priestcraft is the bane of India. Can people degrade their brother and themselves escape degradation? The mass of Brahman and Kshatriya tyranny has recoiled upon their own heads with compound interest, and 1,000 years of slavery and degradation is what the inexorable law of karma is visiting upon them. In a crucial passage, he distinguishes the existing hereditary caste system, which he outright condemned, with what he took to be the original caste system, which is talked about in scriptures like the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata. He says, modern caste distinction is a barrier to India's progress. It narrows, restricts, separates. It will crumble before the advance of ideas. From the time of the Upanishads down to the present day, nearly all our great teachers have wanted to break through the barriers of caste, that is, caste in its degenerate state, not the original system. What little good you see in the present caste clings to it from the original caste, which was the most glorious social institution. He says in another passage that he thinks that this hereditary caste system is going to die a natural death fairly soon, and he's already noticing in his time in the 1890s that there was so much intermixture of castes. And so he says, even the sons of the Nagara Brahmanas are nowadays getting English education and entering into government service or adopting some mercantile business. Even Orthodox pundits of the old school undergoing pecuniary difficulties are sending their sons to the colleges of the English universities or making them choose the callings of Vaidyas, Kayasthas, and other non-Brahmin castes. If the current of affairs goes on running in this course, then it is a question of most serious reflection, no doubt. How long more will the priestly caste class continue on India's soil? The Brahmin caste is erecting with its own hands its own sepulchre, and this is what ought to be. It is good and appropriate that every caste of high birth and privileged nobility should make it its principal duty to raise its own funeral pyre with its own hands. And if you, just to give you a very brief sense of what he meant by the original caste system, he says the following in an 1895 letter. Now take the case of caste, in Sanskrit jati, that is species. Now this is the first idea of creation. Variation, vichitrata, that is to say jati means creation. I am one, I become many. This is from the Vedas. Unity is before creation, diversity is creation. Now, if this diversity stops, creation will be destroyed. So long as any species is vigorous and active, it must throw out varieties. Now, the original idea of jati was this freedom of the individual to express his nature, his prakriti, his jati, his caste. And so it remained for thousands of years. Then what was the cause of India's downfall? the giving up of this idea of caste, which is non-hereditary. As Gita says, this is from 3.24, with the extinction of caste, the world will be destroyed. Again, caste not in the hereditary sense. The present caste is not the real jati, but a hindrance to its progress. It really has prevented the free action of jati, that is caste or variation. Any crystallized custom or privilege or hereditary class in any shape really prevents caste from having its full sway. Okay, so now I'll just mention that in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says in many places, I have created the caste system based on two things, guna and karma. Guna means one's innate qualities, and karma means one's behavior. So caste is determined entirely in terms of these two things, innate qualities and behavior. It has nothing to do with heredity, and I'll just close on this note. I'm a monk of the Ramakrishna order founded by Swami Vivekananda. I was not born a hereditary Brahmin, but I was attracted to his teachings and the organization and became a monk precisely because he didn't believe in hereditary caste. And that was one of the main reasons. And the system in our order is that after about 5 or 6 years in the organization, when we take our brahmacharya vows, we're all given a sacred thread, which is characteristic of the Brahmin. And we're given the Gayatri Mantra. We're initiated in the Gayatri Mantra. And it doesn't matter whether we're an Indian or a non-Indian, a Brahmin or an outcast or a Dalit or whoever, we're all given it, and we're all promoted to the status of a Brahmin in the non-hereditary sense because we have taken to the spiritual path, and we are trying to exhibit the qualities of a Brahmin in the true sense, exhibiting spiritual qualities like compassion and forgiveness and devotion and those kinds of qualities. And that when we take sannyasa a few years later, the sannyasi transcends caste altogether. And so the entire spiritual ideal set by Swami Vivekananda is against the hereditary caste system. Thank you.
Thank you, Swami Medhananda. Over to you, Govind.
Thanks, Murali and Sunita, for inviting me to this very important session. So just just following up on what Swami Medhananda was saying, these left critiques of Vivekananda, I mean, there's a lot of revisionist history. There's a tendency in modern historiography to look at past figures or consider great and reevaluate them. But sometimes, and this is very particular in the case of Vivekananda, I think the best measure, your first step, is to look at how did his contemporaries take him. And in the case of Vivekananda, regarding caste, Vivekananda was one of the chief inspirations behind the first mass lower caste movement in India, which is the Irava movement in Kerala. And we have, I mean, for example, their flagship journal of the Irava movement, Iravas were an untouchable caste in Kerala, was named Vivekodaya in tribute to Vivekananda because they thought he was preaching a Hinduism that demanded the eradication of caste. And as for nationalism, again, his influence on the national movement has been on moderates and liberals. And there's a quote from Bose, Subhash Chandra Bose, who interestingly studied in the same college as Vivekananda, that he was awakened to national service by reading Vivekananda, and that without the Ramakrishna Vivekananda doctrine of the equality of all religions, we cannot have a national movement because India cannot exclusively belong to either Hindus, Muslims, or any other religion. So he thinks that this is the foundation of Indian secularism. That's what Bose says. And regarding, so Swamiji mentioned the ceremony of putting on a thread, the Brahmacharya ceremony. And one of the interesting things that Vivekananda did in his attempt to elevate the lower caste was to invest the sacred thread to Shudras. He did this in a ceremony, I think it was in the Belur Math, which was quite an iconoclastic act in those days. Just to give an example of how rigid the caste system was then, Gandhi was outcast 20 years at around the same time for daring to travel overseas, right? So, and the only thing I would slightly differ on on caste, what Swamiji said is that I don't really believe Vivekananda believed even in the original caste system. I think that when he preaches individuality in the West. He's a radical individualist, and he takes the self of man, which is the manifestation of Atman, as a site of all reality. In a way, he shifts the emphasis from Brahman to Atman. And I think he uses that to promote a philosophy of radical individualism, a humanistic individualism. But when he is talking to Hindus in India, where he tries to, rather than attacking Hinduism, he's trying to say, you don't have to throw away caste. Caste is really individuality. I think it is a philosophical strategy which a lot of social workers and philosophers used. In fact, the Narayana Guru, the lower caste monk reformer from Kerala, he does the same thing. He has a book called Jati Nirnaya, in which, just like Vivekananda, he interprets Jati as species. And they are both drawing from the Sankhya philosophy. But Narayana Guru, from species, he goes on to the idea of the universal, where Vivekananda stresses it as the individual. So as far as the Hindutva appropriation of Vivekananda is concerned, I think it mainly happens only because people have stopped reading Vivekananda. And one easy way in which one can see this is to just look at contemporary accounts of Vivekananda, who he influenced, what people thought of him. In Vivekananda's career in the West, he was mostly associated with universality, and two kinds of universality. One was religious universality, where he said, and he says in his Chicago speech, that all religions are true. And he says this in an unqualified way, no ifs and buts. And I don't think any speaker at that parliament perhaps went that far. And this was one of the key reasons this message resonated with the West. He's saying that all religions are true, they're only different paths to the same destination, which is divinity. The other kind of universalism that Vivekananda was known for was his doctrine that all souls are potentially divine. And human beings, as the most evolved creatures in this world, they represent the manifestation of the divine. So the attitude one must take is towards other human beings is not of service but of worship. Now, both these notions of universality have rather radical implications for religious identity. Because if you think that your religion is a path and that other religions are paths to the same destination, now you may think that maybe there's something slightly special about your path, maybe it's more scenic, it's more efficient, but everyone is going towards the same destination. So your religion is not a matter of being, but it's a matter of mere instrumentality. It's just about how you get to the destination. So this bridges the gap between you and your people of other religious denominations. And this also comes from Vivekananda's belief in the radical equality of all human beings, the idea that all humans are potentially divine. Because then, if you believe that and practice it, and Vivekananda thinks this is one of the core messages of Hinduism, then your primary allegiance is to humankind. It is your allegiance to your religion, your community comes at very, very distant, in the periphery, because you have to treat every human being as a human, actually not as a human, but as God himself. So in that sense, the implications of Vivekananda's universalism is, and Vivekananda thought that the world was moving towards a universal religion. He saw different religions as expressions of the same universal religion. So one of the consequences would be a dilution of religious identity. And Hindutva is a political project that accentuates difference. which rigidifies his religious communion identity, which tells Hindus that you must identify very strongly with being Hindu and being different from other religions. So at the broadest level, one can see that Vivekananda's vision of Hinduism and his socio-political ideology is in the exact opposite direction in which Hindu thought travels. But it goes beyond that. And this is what I have argued in my book, Vivekananda, the Philosopher of Freedom. Vivekananda is actually an ideological foe, an ideological enemy of Hindutva. Now, this has to be understood carefully in the sense that obviously Hindutva comes into formation around 2 decades after Vivekananda's death. But in the sense that we can call, say, Voltaire, the French philosopher, an ideological antagonist, or Thomas Jefferson for that matter, an ideological antagonist of fascism or totalitarianism, we can say that Vivekananda's ideology and thought is the ideological, in fact, I would call him the ideological nemesis of Hindutva, because compared to other ideological antagonists, like say Bhagat Singh or Ambedkar, who are speaking from outside the Hindu tradition and who are opposed to all forms of Hindu nationalism, Vivekananda is speaking from within the Hindu tradition as a Hindu spiritual master. So, so I feel that Hindutva, in appropriating Vivekananda, has actually taken a Trojan horse into their camp, and that is very important that we use Vivekananda's thought against the Hindu right wing. And just to get the sense of Vivekananda, the fact how little religious identity mattered to Vivekananda. In talking to one of his American audiences, he says, if one religion is true, all must be true. And the Hindu religion is as much your property as it is mine. While Hindutva is trying to tell Hindus, look, claim Hinduism, claim this particular thing as yours and only yours. And Vivekananda seemed to have thought of the advent of Sri Ramakrishna as setting in motion a new spiritual age of mankind, which would culminate in the obliteration of all caste and religious differences over centuries. And he tells an American audience, my master used to say that these names as Hindu, Christians, etc., stand as great bars to all brotherly feelings between man and man. We must try to break them down first. They have lost all their good powers and now stand as only baneful influences under which the best of us behave like demons. So he was quite serious about the idea that religious traditions were mere instruments and that humanity had to progress. In fact, he wanted to build a kind of a temple which would have worship of all religions present. And so the number of reasons why I would call Vivek, the number of important points in Vivekananda's thought and philosophy, which stand in diametric opposition to Hindutva thought and the Sangh Parivar's practice of it. In my book, I deal with it rather extensively, but even then, I have only gone into some of the most fundamental of them. I'll just enumerate them. One is, of course, the interpretation of Hinduism. Vivekananda's exposition of Hinduism, which is an extension of Sri Ramakrishna's, and the Sangh Parivars are antithetical. I mean, it's difficult to imagine a version of Hinduism, a notion of Hinduism that is more the polar opposite of Vivekananda's vision than that of the Sangh Parivar. The other important thing is Vivekananda was a radical individualist. He believed that the individual has infinite possibilities, potentialities, and he would brook no restriction on anyone. He demanded complete freedom of thought, complete freedom in thought, action, dress, food, marriage, everything. While, of course, Hindutva is against all this. Another is, of course, the reading of history. Vivekananda, the grievance of Hindutva, which forms the soil of their political project, is that the decline of Indian civilization starts with foreign conquest, first Muslims and then the British. Vivekananda, on the other hand, dates the decline of Indian civilization from around 2 centuries before, 1 or 2 centuries before the Islamic conquest, and he blames the upper caste for it. He calls it the tyranny of the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, which held the lower caste in oppression. This is what in fact, he was in stark contrast to Hindutva's antipathy for Muslim rule. Vivekananda was actually fascinated by the Mughals, especially with Akbar. And there is this, and what he says of the Islamic, this interesting quote where he tells the Hindu audience in India in a public speech, even to the Mohammedan rule, we owe that great blessing, the destruction of exclusive privilege. The Mohammedan conquest of India came as a salvation to the downtrodden and to the poor. That is why 1/5 of our people have become Mohammedan. It is not the sword that did it all. It would be the height of madness to think it was all work of sword and fire. Here, Vivekananda is referring to the fact that most Hindus who converted to Islam were from lower caste. They moved from, it is not conversion by force, but they moved from an oppressive caste hierarchy society to a relatively egalitarian society that gave them social mobility. And this has been commented upon by later historians. So, but I think the most important point of difference between Vivekananda and Hindutva is their idea of Hinduism. So the most consistent part of Vivekananda's idea of religion that he keeps repeating again and again is that all religions have an essential and a non-essential part. By the essential part, he refers to the spiritual truths, while by the non-essential part, he means the forms in which these truths are expressed. So, for example, he says, all forms of religion have an essential and non-essential part. If we strip from the latter, there remains the real basis of all religion, which all forms of religion possesses in common. Unity is behind them all. We call it Allah, Jehovah, the Spirit, love. It is on this unity we need to lay stress, whereas it is on the non-essential that men are apt to lay stress. They will fight and kill each other for these forms to make their fellows conform. Seeing that the essential is love of God and love of man, this is curious to say the least. Now, what is it that Vivekananda calls external forms? And what he means is the entire matrix of ceremonials, symbols, mythology, temples, pilgrimages, rituals. Now, all these things Vivekananda considers to be external religion, forms in which a spiritual truth is expressed. What he says is that the idea of the infinite, the absolute, is too abstract. No one can directly think about it. So we need these concrete forms through which the mind of the novice, and this is for the novice, this is not for the advanced spiritual seeker. For the novice to raise their mind, the suggestion, it is the concrete form through which the abstract spiritual truth can be grasped. But there's nothing special about the form itself, whether it's a temple or a ceremony or anything else. But the fight is always about these external forms of religion, because it is easy for people to confuse the spirit for the material. And in the case of
Govind, sorry, do you want to wrap up soon? Thank you.
Well, yeah, so I will read. So Vivekananda puts it in one of his states where he says, religion is not going to church or putting marks on the forehead or dressing in a peculiar fashion. You may paint yourselves in all the colors of the rainbow, but if your heart has not been opened, if you have not realized God, it is all in vain. We must not forget that colors and all these things are good so far as they help, they are welcome. But they are apt to degenerate, and instead of helping, they retard. And a man identifies religion with externalities. And if you look at the Hindutva project, what Hindutva thinkers, right from Savarkar's idea of Sanskriti to Golwalkar's samskaras, Hindu samskaras, or Deen Dayal Upadhyay's in Bharatiya culture, is basically this matrix of external forms, which they think defines the essence of being Hindu. So they've lashed onto the very paraphernalia that Vivekananda considers to be non-essential. So if Hindus allow themselves to be led by Hindutva, they will be left with only the husk of Hinduism and not its essence. And in that sense, Hinduism is a direct threat, not only to Indian democracy, but also to Hindu spirituality.
Thank you so much, Govind. Sorry for
Yeah,
interrupting there.
I didn't drag on that.
No. That is actually fine. And thank you both so much. We do want to leave some space for time, but being the moderator, I do want to pose a couple questions initially for each of our speakers. And we are here in a Baithak, so we are here to deeply listen. We don't have to agree. We can even agree to disagree on some things, but I feel we've already heard enough to actually move our struggle and commitment forward. So, Swami Medhananda, first question to you is: we often hear Hindus who are influenced by Vedanta who smugly repeat the doctrine of the metaphysical oneness of all beings, but don't show much care for the sufferings and iniquities of this world. In your book on Vedantic cosmopolitanism, you foreground Ramakrishna's influence on Vivekananda for insisting on a non-sectarian, life and world-affirming Vedanta. You specifically show, for instance, how Vivekananda, and I quote your words, traced Shankara's narrowness of heart to his ontological denigration of the world, end quote. Please comment on how such a break from what you call spiritual selfishness, again, your terms, to a philosophy that entails social concern, again, your terms, is critical for opposing the exclusivism of Hindutva and shaping a framework for Hindus to be on the side of social justice in this world. I think you're on mute.
Okay,
Yes.
so you'd like me to answer that now?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So that's a great question / kind of provocation for me to elaborate some aspects of my interpretation of Swami Vivekananda's views. Yes, I think that Swami Vivekananda was actually a scathing critic of a kind of Vedanta which was pervasive in his time. I mean, to the point where in his time, in the 19th century, Vedanta, the word Vedanta, was equated with Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, which metaphysically denies the reality of this entire world and then becomes an easy justification for ignoring social injustice. And so for all of his love for Shankara, Swami Vivekananda couldn't forgive Shankara for his casteism. And the fact that Shankara actually endorsed, this is in his commentary on the Brahma Sutras, he endorsed the policy that if a Shudra, a low caste Hindu, happens to hear the Vedas repeated out loud, that there's something like, I think it's molten wax should be poured into their ears. So something really awful and terrible and horrendous. And Swami Vivekananda said, for all his massive intellect, he had a narrow heart. And I think that Ramakrishna taught Swami Vivekananda to teach a different kind of Vedanta, which is socially grounded, socially aware, and life-affirming. It's what I call Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta philosophy, but we can use other terms. I like to refer to the term integral Advaita as well, because it's a non-duality that encompasses everything, and which means that every being in this world, not just human beings, but non-human animals, plants, all have the same divinity within them. And so by serving others in a spirit of worship, we're serving the divine in others by serving them. That's the idea. And we're worshiping the divine in everyone by serving them. That's what Ramakrishna called Shiva Gyaned Jiva Seva, serving others in a spirit of worship by seeing the divine in all beings. Yeah, I hope that's enough.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Govind, your book shows clearly how Vivekananda is opposed to Hindutva. And in your book, as well as in some part of the words you spoke today, you show how Vivekananda rejected caste injustices consistently in the sharpest of ways. He even made fun of the notions of purity and pollution, transgressed food taboos, and showed up its hypocrisies, and transgressed caste rules with ease. As you point out, Vivekananda clearly locates caste as a social and historical, not a religious phenomenon. Yet, as you note, Vivekananda's seeking of the leveling of society, that's a term at that time that gets put out. Later on, Ambedkar, in a significantly different sense, which I hold as a gold standard, calls for the annihilation of caste. But as Vivekananda seeks that leveling of society, it lacks a clarity, and it, in some sense, relies on the theory of gunas and karma that you mentioned, as well as what Swami Medhananda mentioned, but which seems to me to be a disguise for caste as birth, and quite dubious in accounting for the differences we see in the vagaries of birth. And I'm coming here as a scientist. For example, how do evolutionary psychologists and biologists confirm or explain how we are born in some with some differences? They have a mechanism for it, and it has something to do with natural selection. It has something to do with environment. It has something to do with hereditary genes. Nothing to do in that sense with gunas or actions. But I may also add here that Swami Medhananda has made it clear in one of his lectures that one does not need to accept the guna and the karma concepts in order to be a Hindu. So the question, Govind, is this. Can Vivekananda be a resource for anti-caste struggles today, especially since he's committed to what you very nicely point out, a liberation of the individuality, which goes back to the Nyaya sense, in some sense, of jati as universality versus Vishesha as difference. So any comments on that?
Yeah, I think he's definitely can be used as a resource for against caste, because some of, I don't know of very few thinkers, and even Ambedkar was probably perhaps more polite than Vivekananda in his diatribes against Brahmins for their caste system. I mean, in fact, one historian, I remember his name, who wrote in the 70s or 80s, actually remarks that, it is because the Hindus really venerated Vivekananda that he could say these things. No one else could say this and get away with it. I mean, at some points, he's almost vitriolic with anger at Brahmins. And about his the guna thing, actually Vivekananda does not ever go into guna. He talks only about jati. So Vivek at no, so it will be so in the thinkers like Gandhi tried to, in some way, and I think even Radha Krishnan does this, defend the Varna system as a system of gunas. But nowhere in Vivekananda would you find any mention of the Chaturveda, this or anything. And it's only when he is talking about caste in India, he tries to redefine it by redefining jati as individuality. And interestingly, he does this in a speech in Madras. And this very speech that created a stir of anti-caste sentiments, anti-caste this in South India. One of my own ancestors went there. When Vivekananda was carried along in a carriage, and first day he couldn't make a speech. So but I think he's merely working within the resources of the tradition, because instead of telling Hindus, look, you have got caste in your religion or whatever, and it's terrible. He's saying, look, you don't have to give anything up. You have misunderstood caste. Caste means individuality, and that just means you are individuality as a person. He refers once to astrology, where when you are born, you are assigned particular and something which shows your nature as an individual, not as expressing gunas of rajas and that all that. So I don't think he recruits guna into his account of caste. And in his
maybe
description
I can interrupt you there just so that we have time for other people's questions. Thank you. Okay, so let me just give a counterpoint to that. What I see as counter evidence. This is from a conversation held in Kolkata at Bolaram Bosch's house. After a long conversation about Japan and America, this disciple asked Swami Vivekananda, well, Swamiji, how many disciples have you in the West? Swamiji, a good many. Question, 2,000 or 3,000? Swamiji, maybe more than that. Question, are they all initiated by you with mantras? Swamiji, yes. Question, did you give them permission to utter pranava, which means the Om mantra? Swamiji, yes. Question, how did you, Maharaj? They say that the Shudras have no right to pranava, and none has except the Brahmins. Moreover, the Westerners are mlechas, not even Shudras. Swamiji, how do you know that those whom I have initiated are not Brahmins? Myself. Where could you get Brahmins outside India, in the lands of the Yavanas and the Mlechas? Swamiji, my disciples are all Brahmins. I quite admit the truth of the words that none except the Brahmins has the right to pranava. But the son of a Brahmin is not necessarily always a Brahmin. Though there's every possibility of his being one, he may not become so. The hereditary Brahmin caste and the Brahmanya qualities are two distinct things. Brahman jati or Brahmanit gun duto alada jinish. As there are three gunas, so Govind was questioning whether Swamiji ever defines caste in terms of the three gunas. This is a very good passage where he does. As there are three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, so there are gunas which show a man to be a Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, or Shudra. Question, then you call those Brahmins who are sattvika by nature? Swamiji, quite so. As there are sattva, rajas, and tamas, one or other of these gunas, more or less, in every human being, so the qualities which make a Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, or Shudra are inherent in every man, more or less. But at times, one or other of these qualities predominates in him in varying degrees, and it is manifested accordingly. Naturally, it is quite possible for one to be changed from one caste into another. So I think he's very explicitly here endorsing what he's calling the original caste system. I don't think there's anything weird or insidious about it. I think the original caste system, in a sense, already obtains in most advanced Western countries like the US. I'm living in the US. I grew up in the US. All it means is different people are different. They have different tendencies. They have different temperaments. They have different personality traits. They have different strengths and weaknesses. And a well-functioning society is one that gives us scope, each individual the scope to find a vocation and a calling and to pursue a way of life that is in accordance with their particular temperament and personality. So if I lean toward debating and law, I should be enabled by my society to become a lawyer. It's in that sense that I think he had in mind the original caste system. I don't see any problem with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Govind and Swami Medhananda. I think we have a few questions in the chat here, and they are all in one way or another about caste. And it also tells me we need to actually probably have another Baithak specifically on fleshing out some of these things. And I'll just say this, and Sunita can take over from there. There is something about referencing something called a historic caste. And I'm speaking here as an anthropologist slash historian of some kind. And I find the evidence for that to be all too thin, if any, and it's probably restricted just to some few quotations in discourses, for example, between Yudhishthira and Nahusha, and a few things like that. As far as being a socio-historical system, it's not quite obtaining in that way. I also want to bring in the logic part of it, and all of this is for a future discussion. It's very hard to crush all this. How, for example, does invocation of karma not ultimately end up sacrificing the very good emphasis on action into something to do with birth and rebirth and stuff like that. So I think that kind of confuses the whole thing. Then the last point is to use the same terms, Brahmin, to use the same terms, caste, and speak about, we are talking about another kind of a caste, another kind of Brahmin, also creates some confusion. So I'll leave it at that. And Sunita, over to you if you can actually pose some of the questions from the chat.
Thank you so much. Shravya, my colleague, is synthesizing the questions, consolidating them for me. And they are mostly about caste. So maybe I'll ask both of these together. Where and how does caste as a non-hereditary system appear in the Mahabharata? Because I think maybe Swamiji, you mentioned in the Gita. So somebody's asking about Mahabharata. And then another question is, shouldn't we reject the caste hierarchy and caste names entirely, especially when society makes a judgment of guna and karma? And this can lead to inequality, and as we know it does, and therefore hereditary lack of opportunities. And as you answer those questions, maybe do so with an eye to, you're speaking to a group of people in an organization that has taken a stance, aligned with this concept of the annihilation of caste. We want to do away with it. It doesn't serve us in our aspirations for true justice. So let me stop there and ask you both to respond. Swamiji first.
Thank you. Yeah. So regarding the Mahabharata, Murli mentioned it very briefly, Nahusha, the dialogue, but let me just read you that dialogue in the Mahabharata between, can somebody, I don't know why there's some background noise. Is that my own voice or somebody else's? So, okay, in any case, Nahusha asks, who is a Brahmin? Yudhishthira replies, he is known as a Brahmin in whom truthfulness, liberality, patience, deportment, mildness, self-control, and compassion are found. The marks of the Shudra are not found in a Brahmin, but a Shudra is not necessarily a Shudra, nor a Brahmin a Brahmin. So that means a hereditary Shudra is not necessarily a Shudra in the spiritual sense, and so on. In whomever the Brahmin's marks are found, he is known as a Brahmin, and in whom they are not found, him they designate as a Shudra. Nahusha then replies, if you judge a Brahmin by his conduct, king, then birth has no meaning, my dear sir, as long as no conduct is evident. And then Yudhishthira says, I think that birth is hard to ascertain among humankind because of the confusion of all classes when any man begets children on any woman. Therefore, those see the truth of it who know that conduct is the chief postulate. Okay, so that's regarding the Mahabharata. And then the other question is about whether it might be wise to just jettison the terms Brahman, Vaishya, Shudra, and so on, Kshatriya. That's perfectly fine, as long as we keep the idea. I still think the idea is important. And to be honest, I'm not that sympathetic to the kind of extreme versions of pushes for DEI, even in the West, because I noticed at the very beginning of your introduction, Murli, you used the term equity, which I'm not comfortable with. I actually prefer the term equality rather than equity. For these reasons, I'm not sure that Swami Vivekananda would have advocated equity in the extreme sense that the extreme left people in the West or in India are defending it. And I think it's really important to bring into the discussion Swami Vivekananda's distinction between variety, vichitrata, which he sees as the basis of the original caste system, and what he calls privilege exploitation. And I'll just read one brief statement of his. He says, I am clever in mending shoes. You are clever in reading Vedas, but that is no reason why you should trample on my head. So he's prizing apart these two things, variation from privilege.
Govind? I think you're on mute, Govind. Govind, you're on mute.
Right. To address the question of terminology, I think Vivekananda would have agreed to the annihilation of caste. In fact, he does say that caste will crumble and disappear. And he says that modern competition has done more to destroy caste than any amount of preaching. Vivekananda, and in fact, even Nivedita writes that, when there was later criticism that he wasn't strong enough on caste, that he had no doubt whatsoever in his mind that caste was an institutional disappear. And the other thing is that Vivekananda never claims that there was an original caste system during the Vedic ages that was, in some sense, based on guna or anything of that kind. In a sociological analysis, I don't think he ever does that. The context in which he, so like the conversation with the disciple that Swami Medhananda mentioned, where he asks who is a Brahmin, the theory that he uses is the one that is found in Bhagavad Gita, that each caste personifies a particular guna and is not birth, but the person. I think one has to take into account that there are political possibilities. Vivekananda was dealing mainly with an upper caste Hindu milieu. And I think what he tried to do was to see what can be accomplished there. If you look at the structure of his thought, neither Varna nor Jati or anything finds any place in it. I mean, in fact, in terms of Hinduism, he is clearly says Hinduism indicates only one duty for the soul, that is to realize the absolute. Whether it's been done through
so can I
marriage
just
or non-marriage,
right.
good or evil, is irrelevant. No one can prescribe which path to take. Yeah.
So Govind, can I just read one statement of Swami Vivekananda? This is from his 1900 Bengali essay, Pracho Paschatya, which means the East and the West. I accept that the guna-based caste system was the original one. Unfortunately, a guna-based caste system degenerates into a hereditary one within 2 to 4 generations. The original Bengali, gunogoto jati adi shikar kori, kintu gun duchar purushe bongshogoto hoye danai. So I think that's a direct contradiction of what you're saying, but I could be wrong.
Again, I think that I think one thing we forget about dialogue, that if you're trying to change someone's mind, is that you try and talk to them in terms in which you think you will be able to calibrate. And that is my reading of Vivekananda, is that his uses of guna and even of jati as variation, I am not convinced. I find Vivekananda to be far too sharp a thinker to have believed in what I think are completely atavistic notions. And
what is atavistic about variation? What's so wrong about saying that different people are born with different personalities and temperaments? What exactly is malicious about it?
No, the idea that jati represents variation. Surely, if you look at all the things that have been written about jati, to claim that this is the original sense of jati is a very contestable claim. It's a convenient claim for a political purpose. If you look at Vivekananda's reading of history, and see, one thing we have to admit is that there are innumerable interpretive issues around Vivekananda. Something that I think, first of all, the biggest problem starts with the fact that the collected works of Swami Vivekananda is for a spiritual purpose. So the chronology follows is, of course, not of date. Then there is the problem that he's talking to various audiences, is delivering philosophy through speeches, there are recorded conversations, there are interviews. One needs really, if we are to take Vivekananda seriously as a thinker, one has to go into the interpretation of Vivekananda as a serious topic, as an intellectual task. And I mean, I don't think there's a ready-made template. I think it's something that one has to inquire into. And perhaps if we do that, we might get more clarity on these things that we are disagreeing about.
Okay, I'm going to move on to maybe. I think there are 2 questions that Shravya has sent me. Let's see if we can answer them quickly so that we can send everybody off on time. So one is, I'll just continue the caste theme. There's a question, one more question on caste. Basically, how did, if the original caste system, if it's true that it was based on guna, which when you read the Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda, it doesn't seem like that to me. So I do have a question about that. But the question here is, how did it, if the original caste system is guna based, how did it become birth based? Let's question first, and then go on to the second one.
Right. Yeah. So first of all, I want to go back to something Murli said. Speaking as an anthropologist, he said, it seems unlikely, or at least there's no good evidence that the original caste system was guna based. I'm happy to agree with you on that. I mean, I don't think that there's good evidence either way. The only evidence I think indirectly is that some of the scriptures, like the Bhagavad Gita, talk about it in what seems to be, or arguably is, a non-hereditary way. And I don't think much depends on Vivekananda's historical claim that the original caste system was socio-historically a guna-based caste system. I think what's more important is the principle of the original caste system, which is vichitrata, variation. I think one of the great things about modern advanced Western countries is that it embraces variation in society and encourages people to express their individuality as they see fit. And that's all I think that the original caste system meant. So whether it actually existed or actually obtained at any point in India's past, I don't think that's the crucial thing, and it may not have. Not much depends on that. Regarding the Purusha Suttam, it's just I find it really fascinating, Sunita, by the way. I started my Vedanta Hindu lecture with an incident where I was invited to Boston College, and a professor there who was giving an introduction to Hinduism class. The first slide in our class on the first day of the semester, introducing Hinduism to a bunch of impressionable undergraduates, was the quote from Purusha Suktam, which you quoted. And it's ironic to me. I mean, I don't know whether you identify as Hindu, but this is a Catholic woman who's at least implicitly trying to convert Hindus to Christianity. And they're making the same claim you are, which is that the Purusha Suktam is defending a hereditary caste system. And I challenged her because I see nothing in the Purusha Suktam which actually defends hereditary castes. It has the metaphor of the body, but to align the Shudras with the feet doesn't mean that it has anything to do with heredity. And if you know what amputees, you need the feet just as much as you need the head. So I don't necessarily see anything, any direct evidence that the Purusha Suktam defends a hereditary caste system.
Shall I go to the next question, or Govind, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I think we should also keep in mind that Vivekananda was living and thinking in the 1890s that the kind of historical and sociological knowledge available to him was very limited. And there were all kinds of competing narratives and colonial narratives. A lot of history he had to depend on Western society, had their own biases. So, and sociological knowledge was hardly advanced. It was being developed in the West, honest comedy and all that, but Vivekananda did not have access to this. So one has to consider the knowledge economy under which he functioned. And at that plane, we are very much in advance of Vivekananda and the kind of tools of analysis and information that we have.
Thank you. I'm just going to try and get in this one last question. There are critiques of Vivekananda's engagement of the Vedanta tradition, even situated within his historical moment. For example, Hugh Urban has argued that Vivekananda was embarrassed by the tantric practices of Ramakrishna. To the extent that Vivekananda's view of Hinduism or Vedanta is concerned with screening our practices he deemed unsuitable, is Vivekananda not vulnerable to his biases?
It's a nice question. So here's the thing. Swami Vivekananda would often distinguish the teachings of Ramakrishna that are universal from those that are meant for specific people. And he felt that the aspects of his teachings that were universal, that would be beneficial to everybody, were primarily the Vedantic ones. But for instance, in a letter to, I think it was Mary Hale, he said, Kali worship is my special fad. This is the exact statement. Kali worship is my special fad. That's obviously a fundamentally tantric practice. He says, but then he says, but you don't see me preaching that to anybody. That explains, I think that's just a direct answer to the question, which is that he loved Tantra and he loved Kali and he saw Ramakrishna as Kali, but that doesn't mean that he needs to broadcast it to everybody because he didn't think that it would be beneficial to everybody.
If I could make a point, we should also remember that Ramakrishna himself, as far as I know, did not teach Tantra to any of his direct disciples. Am I correct there, Swami Vivekananda?
Sorry,
did he teach Tantra did Ramakrishna instruct any of his direct disciples in Tantra?
See, the thing is, it's not. See, what is Tantra, first of all? The thing is that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable is a fundamental tenet of Tantra. That's something he taught to everybody across the board. We are Tantric. I mean, the Tantra principle that Brahman and Shakti are non-different is fundamental to Tantra. We accept it fully. We accept Divine Mother. We worship Kali. We have a Kali worship every year, duly done with all the proper rituals. So it's not that we're anti-tantric and all those things. We're against the left-handed Tantra, but Sri Ramakrishna said about that too, and Swami Vivekananda agreed. He said it seems to have benefited a certain small number of people, and so that's also a path. That's our line on Tantra. I don't actually see that we're anti-tantric in that sense. I don't think that it's healthy to encourage everybody to do it because there are a lot of risks and dangers involved in that path.
Murli, do you want to chime in and bring us to a close of this part before I say a goodbye to everybody?
Okay, well, thank you so much to both our speakers, Swami Medhananda and Govind, and to the number of questions that are in the chat. I think several of them require more careful and more compassionate working through of ideas. And therefore, I vote for us to have another Baithak devoted to that. And I'll just end with this. The idea that I spoke right at the start of philosophy and activism needing each other is precisely at work here. That is, that there are several branches, I would say, several affiliates, I would say, several spokespeople and proponents of Hindutva, which I see as a nakedly now available for all to see ethno, religio, hyper nationalist practice and philosophy at play. Many of them tend to actually rationalize caste away in precisely the ways that the path towards this positing of an original caste, not on birth, which is great, but on these other things, they too seem to do it. How do we distinguish ourselves from them? That cannot be the only reason why we go into it. So it has to go into the depths of the philosophical parts of it. And I'll be very happy to come in again wearing a different hat, which I've worn anyway, and that is as someone who does teach some things about anthropology, cognition, evolutionary biology, and psychology too. And how does a scientist therefore answer those questions? But I'll leave it at that. And I do think that there are some things in the chat that require citations. We will send them to you as a follow-up email. We will consult with both our speakers. Over to you, Sunita, but thank you so much, the two speakers.
I want to give both Swamiji and Govind a moment. If there's anything more you would like to add, given the discussion we have had, we will continue inside our membership to go deeper into everything that you have shared, and we hope we can come back to you to come and help us as we process everything and continue our journey. But before I let everybody go, if I could ask each of you to take a moment to just give your parting thoughts.
Sure. So I'll go first, and then okay, Govind ji can go first. It doesn't matter. Why don't Sunita tell us who should go first?
Well, Govind was speaking, so go ahead.
On caste, I think more than whatever conceptualization that Vivekananda used, I think we should look at what exactly he was saying. In that, so Vivekananda was very, very clear that Hindu society was atrociously oppressive of the lower caste. So he says, for example, that I have no doubt that in ancient times, the Shudras among Hindus were as oppressed as the the Helots among the Spartans. And he also says this: no religion on earth preaches the dignity of humankind in as lofty a vein as Hinduism, and no religion on earth treads on the necks of the poor and downtrodden in as atrocious a manner as Hinduism. So in his statements, Vivekananda is very clear that structurally caste is one of the most oppressive institutions there is. So I think that is what is much more important in reflecting his views on caste than concepts he might have employed, especially because he employs them in speeches, in dialogues, impersonal dialogues, rather than in something like a written text.
Thank you. Swamiji?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it seems like a major part of the discussion has to do with the original caste system posited by Vivekananda. So I want to just say I have a few parting thoughts about it. So I think Murli and others are right that the original caste, this idea of an original caste system based on guna and karma, has been appropriated by the right wing. That is problematic. But Vivekananda himself has been appropriated by the right wing. That doesn't mean we should just throw out the baby with the bathwater and just jettison Vivekananda. That's the whole purpose of this whole discussion, actually, is Swami Vivekananda's complex legacy. So in exactly the same way, I'm just saying structurally, just because right-wing Hindus have appropriated a particular concept, namely the original caste system, to defend the hereditary caste system, doesn't mean that the concept of the original caste system is somehow thoroughly contaminated, that it's unrehabilitatable. I think, in fact, that it can and should be rehabilitated in the sense that Vivekananda specifies, which is as vichitrata, because I think right now, the extreme leftists, I think, have welcomed and embraced, they have ushered in the extreme right wing in the US. That's why Trump got reelected, because of the excesses of the left. And so when we emphasize too much this kind of DEI wokeism. I think we're inviting the opposite extremes to become active. I think that's happening throughout the world. And I think one healthy antidote to that is the concept of vichitrata. The idea of human variation, I think, is extremely important. It's something that this idea of equity and DEI is not just overlooking, but actively denying and suppressing in a way that I find unrigorous and problematic.
Swamiji, what you just said would require an hour or more for all of us to engage with you. And it's in a way, I mean, the Baithak is supposed to be a format where we engage across nuance and across, perhaps difference. And so we've truly done that. And it's not just Swami Vivekananda, but it's the whole Hindu traditions that are in that same boat. On the one hand, being, hijacked, we say, by, the Hindu right, the Hindutva brigade. And on the other hand, we are trying to find a way to be Hindu truly be Hindu in a way that accords with a sense of justice for all. And so this conversation about Swami Vivekananda is a microcosm of that larger struggle of, in my mind, salvaging out of these Hindu traditions what really is liberatory, and being bold enough to let go of the parts of it that don't resonate with such a liberated view of the world. So I want to thank you all. And as I said before, as we inside the organization continue to grapple with these issues and process this conversation, we'll come back to both of you, and of course Murli, and also Anantanand Rambachan, who's on our advisory board. He will be part of this journey with us, and I hope you will welcome us into the ongoing dialogue. So, and I also want to thank everybody who came. I hope you all found this conversation as informative and thought-provoking, as certainly I did. My phone was really going crazy with a lot of our members being so excited about this conversation, and I'll go back and read them, but I think we've really hit a note. There's a hunger for exactly this type of conversation, and this is pretty much the first time we've had a conversation like this in the organization. So thank you so much. We'll be sending out the recording of this webinar to everybody who RSVP'd. We'll be putting it on YouTube and publishing it, to the wider world as well. We are going to be sending out a list of suggested readings, and if our speakers want to add to that list of readings, we'll include your other resources as well. And to all of you, if you would like to stay engaged with Hindus for Human Rights work on Hindu liberation theology and the exploration of a progressive liberatory Hinduism, I highly encourage you to please consider becoming an official member of Hindus for Human Rights. You can do so on our website. There's the Join Hindus for Human Rights page on our website. That's where you do it. And I'm hoping Shravya will drop that into I don't know if there is a chat where she can drop it, but you can all find Hindus for Human Rights /join HfHR. And once you become a member, you can join our members' WhatsApps, where guaranteed it's already happening. We will be talking about the things that were discussed in our conversation today and so much more. So if you liked this, if this is a kind of issue and topic and conversation that is nourishing your soul, please join us and be on this journey with us. We have a Liberatory Hinduism working group. And as I mentioned before, we have a new initiative called Samadarshini, which is the theological work that will complement this kind of conversation, which is more for lay people like myself and most of us. So thank you all, especially to our wonderful panelists, Govind, Krishnan, Swami Medhananda, and to Murli, of course. Stay tuned for our upcoming Baithaks. The next one, next month, it's during Women's History Month, and it's going to be about gender and equality and Hindu traditions. And our speakers are going to be female practitioners of Hinduism, 3 Panditas, and I'm very excited about it. And then the April Baithak it's during Dalit History Month, and it's going to go back to a lot of these questions around caste. So please join us, please stay tuned, and thank you all so, so much. Namaste.
Thank you.